Welcome back to Stay Tuned, Supporting Transition Age Youth. This podcast is brought to you by the Transitions to Adulthood Center for Research at UMass Chan Medical School, Department of Psychiatry, and in partnership with our research sponsor, the National Institute for Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research. I'm your co-host, Emily, and today we are joined by AmandaGrace. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. I apologize if you can hear the snowplow outside. I decided to come by all of a sudden. But my name is AmandaGrace Krier. I am a certified peer specialist in Pennsylvania, working predominantly with youth and young adults. But I am an employee at Youth Move National, and I am a youth program specialist and trainer.
Hey, welcome. It's nice to have you. And
Thank
do you
you.
go by AG mostly, or do you go by AmandaGrace?
I go by both. It's whatever, anybody else is comfortable with. I understand that Amanda Grace sometimes is a mouthful for people, especially if you're not from the South where like double names is very common.
Yeah.
Whatever floats your boat, I go by both.
All right. Good. Well, I think we can just jump right into it. So I know that you do a lot of self-advocacy. So I was wondering, first, can you define self-advocacy? And then can you also give us some examples of how you started advocating for yourself? So maybe like in work or in school or just in general?
Yeah. So the textbook definition of self-advocacy is learning how to advocate for your needs and your wants. But I think that self-advocacy goes beyond so much more than that because in approaching self-advocacy, you have to know what your needs are. You have to be able to sit down with yourself and be really open and honest about what are my needs, what are my wants, and also trying to identify avenues in order to attain those needs. And I I learned how to advocate for myself at a very young age through my mom. I think that as I continued to grow, especially as, I continued to grow as a young adult, I had to learn how to advocate for my needs and wants without my mom there. And that was a little bit of a challenge, just like growing up is a challenge, but in my work, in my school, and I think that my first really big thing that I did in advocating for myself as a disabled person is that I was being treated unfairly in the workplace. Myself and multiple people who identified as disabled were being treated unfairly. Our hours were being cut, and we decided to stage a walkout. And I was 17 years old, walking out of my work because I was being treated unfairly because of my disability. And that was just kind of like the start of how I began to self advocate for myself as a young adult.
Wow, that's really impressive that you're able to do that. I feel like not many people are, well, I guess not even just brave enough to do walkout, but I feel like that is something that takes a lot of courage, and you kind of have to be like at your wits' end, I'm sure. So it's terrible that you got to that point, but I hope that it was actually helpful. And I also think that it's great that your mom was a role model for you in that. Was she always like that? Like, when you're growing up, was she always serving as a role model for advocacy, or was it kind of as you got older?
I would say yes. Growing up, so I was diagnosed with attention deficit disorder when I was around 5 years old. And when my mom was doing a lot of the research about what my life would look like, she read a publication in the early 2000s that said not to expect much for my future because children with learning disabilities typically don't move on to higher education. And that kind of set the tone that my mom was like, I'm going to have to fight for my child because nobody else is going to fight for my child. And so it was an uphill battle through public school. It really was. That I had a 504 plan. So if you don't know what that is a accommodations document. And my accommodations were not anything that were crazy, and they were not trying to give me advantages that other kids didn't have. It was more so it's a document to provide equity in the classroom. And I had things on there like I get extra test time, or if I forgot a pencil in my locker, that the teacher could give me a pencil. And something as simple as that was something that the teachers, a lot of them were not willing to accommodate for, even though they were required to. It was a fight that they didn't understand why I just couldn't remember to bring a pencil. And I remember my mom going into my meeting in 8th grade with a handful of pencils that year to give out to all the teachers because 7th grade was a nightmare. And they said, "We'll just we'll just give her a pencil. It's not a big deal." So it really it it wasn't until I think 9th grade that I really started to to believe in myself, because I think that there is also a stigma when it comes to children with learning disabilities, and I thought I was stupid. I thought that there was something wrong with me, and it wasn't until 9th grade where I got a teacher who also had a daughter with ADHD, and he provided me to take tests audibly because I knew the answers. I just couldn't formulate them onto the page, and I went from a D student to a B student immediately, and I think that was the start in a long journey of learning self-advocacy, because I also had to build up that courage in myself that I was worthy of so much more than what I was being provided within public schools and the treatment that was being provided in public schools.
Wow. Yeah, I think it's amazing really that you were able to well, that first that your mom was able to do that for you, and then as you got older, you were also able to take on that role and stand up for yourself. But yeah, I mean, I'm sorry that your teachers weren't as accommodating when you were younger. I think I'm sure that was very frustrating and definitely not okay. But I'm glad that you found some avenues to help make that work for you and especially with like your 504 plan. I think
Mhm.
that's something that a lot of people don't know about or like they just don't realize that they might qualify for it. I know for me personally, like I also have ADHD and I wasn't actually diagnosed until like this year. So I wasn't diagnosed until I was an adult. But when I look back on when I was in school, I do kind of think like yeah, it probably would have been helpful to have some sort of accommodation, and even if it is just little things like what you're saying, like, if I did forget a pencil and someone was able to give me one and it's just not a big deal and doesn't make you feel like stupid or forgetful or anything, it's just we're all wired differently and some people just need different things, So I'm glad that you were able to finally figure out what did work for you, but it sounds like it was frustrating for a while. Well, that kind of goes into my second question, actually. You've already answered a little bit, but well, I guess I was wondering, like, were you always good at self advocacy, or was that something that you had to kind of practice along the way? Was there something that happened that made you realize, like, enough is enough and pushed you to eventually stand up for yourself?
I don't know if I was necessarily always good at self-advocacy, because I also had to learn how to do it in a manner that the people who I was speaking to were going to be receptive of what I was saying to them. That I think as women, um, a lot of times when we are assertive, we are told that we are abrasive. Now, granted, I might have been abrasive. I'm also from the Philadelphia area, and we are a people who are known to be quite abrasive. But I did have to learn over time that I needed to sometimes change my tone, and that just because one person says no, that doesn't mean the answer is always no when it comes to self advocacy, because that person just might not be in the space to understand the situation. And sometimes you have to revisit that multiple times.
Well, I
So I
like what you
guess
just said about, like, sometimes you do have to go to different people, like, not everyone is going to say yes, or not everyone is gonna be accommodating the first time you ask.
I don't know if that there was a point where I thought enough was enough. I think that a lot of my journey growing up, I always thought enough was enough. That I never really understood why I was treated differently. And then I guess when it comes to advocacy in my personal journey, I guess I did have enough is enough moment when I became an adult, when it came to seeing how youth serving systems are not always as youth serving and as youth friendly as they claim to be. So I guess that as an advocate, not so much as a self advocate, but when it comes to being a youth advocate or an advocate for youth, that that was my enough is enough moment, that I was able to take my lived experience and say that this is not okay, that this system is not serving us, and that there does not have to be a repeat of my story for younger generations, that we can evolve, that we can change the system, and that like our voices can be heard and they deserve to be heard.
Yeah. So yeah, you had, your own struggles throughout your life, and then you also realized that other people were struggling with this, and the help wasn't adequate, or it wasn't doing as much as it claimed to be doing. So you started then advocating for other young adults as well, it sounds like?
Yeah, I I have a fun pastime where I like to bully legislators. That I spend a lot of time at the Pennsylvania state capitol, where I talk to legislators about legislation that is going to impact youth, about mental health funding. And they don't always like to talk to me, but I'm a constituent. I live here in Pennsylvania, that this is something that affects my life, that affects my brother's life, that affects the youth that I work with as a peer specialist. And so I, I definitely don't think that bullying legislators is probably the best thing, but sometimes as a constituent, you have to stalk a legislator, for lack of better words, in order to see results, to have your voice heard, especially as a constituent.
Yeah, you have to be persistent, it sounds like.
Yes. Persistent. Stalker's not a good word. Persistent, that's a good word.
We'll rephrase it a little. I think that's really important too, that you're able to, take it to a higher level, and, like, within your state, you're able to stand up for people. It's not just like, you know, not just you, not just people around you, which that's amazing too, but I think it's really important that people realize that's also an option, that you can go even a step higher.
Yeah. Yeah, we have some really awesome youth who are here in Pennsylvania who are refusing to take no for an answer when it comes to their mental health within schools. That we have a current bill here in Pennsylvania that we're awaiting approval, but it's already gone in committee. So it's out of committee now and it's going to be on the either the House or the Senate floor, but it's going to allow students to have mental health days. And that was a bill that was co-authored by youth for youth. And that's just, one of the amazing things that youth advocates are doing here in Pennsylvania, that they're really having their voice heard. And it's just really awesome to see that there are certain people in legislation that will sit down and they will hear us out and they will take action. Like they're not just going to say things to appease the public, that they're actually going to put legislation to what their words are gonna take action.
Well, yeah, that is amazing. I think it's really important that we have things like mental health days, and also just having young adults themselves be part of these conversations, because especially if it's affecting us, and like if the outcome is going to directly impact us, I think it's really important that we also have a say in what's being written and what's being decided on. But if people aren't really ready to take it to that level, if like our listeners right now are wondering how they can start advocating for themselves, do you have any like tips for how someone could start if they're completely new to this? Like what types of things can they even advocate for, or what would that look like?
I think that something that is very I don't wanna use the word simple, but something that anybody can do is that you can advocate for legislation, and that is just as simple as sending an email, but I think when it comes to self-advocacy, you can start with your doctor's office. I think that we don't always, especially as youth, we don't always get our voices heard within the doctor's office because sometimes your parents in the room or your doctor might blow you off. I don't know what the statute is in other states, but I know in here in Pennsylvania not a lot of people know that at age 14 you are allowed to make medical decisions for yourself, that you're allowed to ask for your parent to step out of the room. You're allowed to have discussions about what medication, what treatments. You're allowed to have a say legally here in Pennsylvania, and I think that needs to expand into more states as well. But it starts with having a conversation, but even more so, I think it might even start with having a conversation with yourself in the mirror. You have to start somewhere, and I think that building up your own self-confidence and who you are as a person is a great way to start, that you are worthy of change. You are worthy of a beautiful and happy life, no matter what that looks like for you. So yeah, I guess like starting out very small with just cultivating who you are, and then building from there. And there are also amazing organizations like the National Alliance on Mental Illness. They have a chapter network. You can go on their website and find a NAMI in your area. And they also have support groups and educational classes that can teach you and how to strengthen your voice and how to advocate for yourself, whether that is in the doctor's office or whether that is to the Oval Office.
Well, yeah, that's good to know. I'll have to look into that and link those for us in the description. But yeah, I mean, I really liked what you just said about, even just starting with having a conversation with yourself. That's really important because you don't know what you need to ask for unless you know what you need to ask for. Like, you don't if you don't know what you need, then how are you gonna even begin? So I do think that's really important. And I think also talking to your doctor is good advice as well because honestly, like, that wasn't something that I would have thought of, but that is a good place, like, especially if you are 14 or older and you're in a state where that's allowed. I think even if you have stigma at home or with your parents or whatever your situation is, it is good to know that you have that option, and you can at least just, like, talk to them about it
Yeah.
and see what your doctor says because I feel like a lot of people wouldn't really necessarily think of that, especially for mental health. You think of your doctor as more physical health, but that's good to know, that's good advice. I know that you work with Youth Move National, and on your website, there's a phrase, "Nothing about us without us." I was wondering if you could talk to us about what that means and what that means for you as well.
Nothing about us without us is a term that started within, I believe, the disability community, but I think it applies to all serving systems, that we deserve to have a say in whether that is our treatment, whether that is legislation that affects us. We deserve to have a say in systems that directly impact us. And what that means specifically for youth and young adults in advocacy is that for a long time, youth have been removed from the conversation. That, and even more so, that more recently they've been given a tokenized seat at the table. That, oh, we have a youth on our board, but nothing about us without us means that we really need to have equitable say in things that impact us, whether that is having a board and actually our voices being heard on that board, that we just deserve a say, that we should be equal partners in systems of change, and that there just should be nothing about us without us.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
do think
I
that's
do
really
think.
important, and yeah, we had a guest recently, Josh from our young adult youth advisory board, and we were kinda talking about this too, where there are a lot of places that have things like the YAB but it is more tokenizing, and, I mean, I think, like, from what I've heard, I think at UMass, luckily, like, we do actually do a pretty good job of, not making people feel tokenized, But I think it can be really easy for organizations to kind of just fall into that as a default, because if they're not really listening to the young adults or if they're just not really taking what they're saying into account, then, it's kind of useless in a way. It's kind of just wasting everyone's time. And so I do think, I'm glad that like where I work, we actually do a good job of it, but I'm sure that there are plenty of places that could use some improvements. Do you have any advice for any organizations that aren't necessarily doing a good job of that? Like anything that you wish that people would do better?
I think that my advice for organizations is to learn or even to remember that lived experience is something that cannot be replicated. That I think that education and certifications and degrees, I think they have their own space, but there's something about lived experience that cannot be replicated in a classroom. And it holds its own weight. And I think that if we have more inclusive spaces where people who have lived experience are able to come in and be heard, it's going to create more well-rounded just well-rounded facilities, well-rounded curriculum. It's just going to expand more on whatever it is that the goal of the board or the organization is trying to attain.
Yeah. Yeah, I completely agree. And I liked what you said too about, you can have these degrees, you can have this work experience, this life experience really, but young adults, like, we bring something unique to the table and, like, our perspectives are really important, and especially if, like, you're an organization that's working for us, for young adults, then you can't really know what's going on with us unless you talk to us, and, like, talk to, like, a variety of young adults and not just, like, one person from one group or, like, you kinda need that well-rounded approach, and you need to, like, actually be authentic about your goals and make sure that the young adults that you're talking to are actually like, their voices are being heard.
It needs to be an ongoing effort because as times change, so do the demographics that somebody who is 35, I'm even 25, and I don't have the same lived experience as somebody who is 15 years old, especially after post-pandemic, that we need to be continuously trying to attain more and more lived experience as the times change in order to really get a clear picture as to what the current lived experience is for younger generations and youth voice.
Yeah, 100%, and it's always gonna change, and it's always gonna, you know be different from generation to generation, and but that's a good thing, it's like that's just how life works, and also, like, it's good to have those different perspectives and keep learning and growing. Like, because like, we can learn and grow from people who are older than us, but it goes both ways, they can also pay attention to what's going on with us and make us feel heard and help us out if they have the power to do so.
Exactly.
Okay. Is there anything we didn't cover that you wanted to make sure we talked about today or
There is no right or wrong way to do self advocacy. That self advocacy is all about getting your needs met, and your needs might not be the same as my needs, but it doesn't mean that yours are any less valid. So self-advocacy looks different for everybody, and no matter what that looks like for you, it's valid.
I like that. I think it's also good to note that it's not selfish to advocate for yourself, especially if, like, say you have ADHD or, whatever it is, like, we're not all the same and we're not all set up on the same playing field or whatever it may be, like with work, with school, just with daily life. Everybody needs something different. And I think it's fine if you know what that is and you go after it. And I think it's actually really important that you do so.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for talking to us today.
Thank
Um,
you.
If you would like to contact us, you can email us at staytuned@umassmed.edu and check out the Transitions ACR website at umassmed.edu/transitionsacr. Thanks for being here and be sure to stay tuned for next week.